our guest speaker, who's been waiting patiently, Dr. Colleen Cuthbert. She's a nurse practitioner, doctorate, Alberta Health Services, an assistant professor, Faculty of Nursing, University of Calgary, Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Patient and Family-Centered Cancer Survivorship. And with that kind of title, our expectations for your level of presentation, Colleen, no pressure here, but it's up quite high. We're quite anxious to hear what you are going to share with us tonight about research and involving the patients and families. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Colleen, and Rhett, you can start guiding or be guided by her instructions on her slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad and Dorothy, for inviting me to speak. I guess I should ask first if everybody can hear me okay. If there's any problems? Okay, good. I've given lots of talks before, but never actually, as of yet, in a virtual environment. So I'm hoping this all goes fairly smoothly, but we'll see. We can figure it out together. And as Brad said, I'm going to be talking about how I have gone about engaging patients and family caregivers as partners in cancer research. And a lot of my clinical practice experience comes from working with colorectal cancer patients, but I have definitely worked with prostate cancer patients as well. So some of my examples will be colorectal cancer specific, but I think it definitely fits for a general audience. When I say patients as partners, I always mean patients and family caregivers, but it's just easier to say patients. So I don't know if there's any family caregivers here at the meeting, but I mean to include you as well. So I think I just need to ask Rhett to advance the slides. Is that how this works?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I want to start by talking about how it is I started to think about research differently. And during my PhD, I did a research project, and so I think some people from the prostate cancer community were involved. So I tested an exercise intervention with family caregivers, and I somehow convinced a whole group of people to come together and exercise twice a week for 24 weeks, and got them to answer a few questions about whether or not it made them feel better, was their mood better, did their fitness improve, and of course I had a pretty good suspicion that exercise would make them feel better, and it did. But what I didn't really get, or I didn't really understand until the end of the study, was how much my interaction with this amazing group of research participants would fundamentally change my views about research. And so this is just a picture of some of the participants from that study. And these pictures are all, I have permission to show them. So one of the participants in the study said to me at the end, you can't be one of those people that just gets your PhD and you're done. Said this work is really important and you've changed people's lives. And then he said to me, how are you going to keep this going for all of us? And it really made me think about my responsibility as a researcher, and it kind of scared me. But he made me realize that the goals of research are really different depending on who you are. So if you're a patient versus a researcher versus a healthcare administrator, and really as researchers, we need to think carefully about ultimately what we're trying to accomplish and for whom. Next slide. So I finished my PhD, I think, with more questions than answers, which I've been told is the whole point of doing a PhD. So I guess that was an accomplishment. But one of the biggest questions that I had and continue to have and continue to work on is this thought about how can we build partnerships to think about and do research differently. And that's kind of the, I would say the key, one of the highlights of, or one of the important points of this talk tonight. So next slide. So just a very brief overview of kind of some of the points that I'll be talking about as we go through this presentation. I want to just give you a brief overview of some of the ways historically people have been involved in research, just to give you an idea of kind of where we've been and where I think we're going. And then I'll talk about new perspectives of the research partnership. I have some examples that are based on my own research and others of how patients have been involved across the research process. And then I'll pose some ideas about where I think we're going with respect to cancer research from a patient engagement perspective. And then there should be lots of time for questions at the end, or comments, or for you to give me your ideas about this topic. So I currently am involved with a number of patient partners in various research projects, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that I learned early on is that the words that I use as a researcher are not always the words that fit with everyone's experience. And so I learned early on that it's a good idea to put some definitions out there so that it just gives you a framework of what I'm talking about. And I'm always open to hearing people's thoughts about how these definitions fit for them or don't. So research is very simply a systematic process of answering a question. A volunteer is a person who freely offers to take part in an enterprise or a task. Next slide. A participant is a person who takes part in something. And a subject, which I would argue is an old terminology now, is a person or thing being discussed, described, or dealt with. And then next slide. And patient-oriented research, which is the type of research that I most often engage in, has been defined by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as research that engages patients as partners, focuses on patient-identified and priorities, and improves patient outcomes. And then they go on to kind of extend this definition by saying this research conducted by multidisciplinary teams in partnership with stakeholders aims to apply the knowledge generated to improve healthcare systems and practices. So I know that's a kind of a big mouthful, but it's really this idea about engaging with patients as partners and focusing on priorities and outcomes that are important to the patients themselves. Next slide. So this is a very brief, I'm kind of a history buff, and so this is just a very brief history of how we have engaged with patients as partners or not throughout the history of research. And I should say that I just want to give an overview of where we've been and where we're going. So I definitely don't, I like to be sensitive when I'm talking about certain things that have happened from a historical context. And I just want to say that I have no opinions, yes or no, about whether this was right or wrong. So in 1620, Francis Bacon, who was a philosopher, argued that research should ultimately benefit humanity. So there were some good ideas going way back. In 1796, Edward Jenner inoculated an 8-year-old with cowpox to develop the smallpox immunization. In the 1930s, all the way up to 1972, there was a series of experiments, if anybody has heard of the Tuskegee syphilis studies, which I'm shocked that they went on till 1972, but the people that were participating in that research actually didn't know that they were research subjects. So I think this really highlights the whole idea of informed consent and how at one point in our history of research, informed consent wasn't needed. In the Second World War, we know that German scientists were conducted morally abominable research on concentration camp prisoners. And this is important to note from a research history perspective, because that led to something called the Nuremberg trials, which on the next slide, you'll see that actually led to the Nuremberg Code, which was the first code of ethics for research on human subjects. So we're starting to see that patients have rights as research participants. In 1951, there was a patient named Henrietta Lacks. I don't know if anybody's read the book, The Amazing Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's very good. She was a cancer patient who had cervical cancer, and it was a very rapidly dividing cancer. And her doctors took a biopsy of her cancer, and they were able to create this immortal cell line called the HeLa cells. And those are still used in basic cancer research today. And what's interesting about that is they never asked if they could use her tissue to develop this cell line. And her family never knew about it. And it wasn't discovered until much later that she never consented to this use of her tissue. In the late 1950s, we saw drugs like thalidomide being released for use prior to very rigorous safety testing. And again, that kind of changed the way we thought about clinical trials and drug trials, and realizing that we need to be a lot more thorough with understanding side effects before we release a drug. And then in 1964, at the Declaration of Helsinki, the ethical principles for involving research in human subjects was declared. And the Declaration of Helsinki is still quoted in our ethics documents today when we're talking about research participation. Next slide. In the 1960s and 70s, there was quite a few studies that were conducted on vulnerable populations, and this further highlighted this need to protect humans who are involved in research. And that from that stemmed in the 1980s and 2000s a number of documents about how to ensure we are protecting the rights and welfare of research subjects, but we're still using that word research subject even in the early 2000s. In 1994, there was kind of a watershed moment, and I don't know if anybody has heard the phrase, "nothing about me without me." It was a patient named Valerie Bingham, and she was at a health summit conference, and she was at a talk around patient and physician collaboration around care. And she said, so what you're really talking about is this idea of nothing about me without me. And this statement has been taken up very broadly by patient advocacy groups to promote this idea of patient-centered care and patient-oriented research. And now into the 2000s, we have many organizations that have developed strategies for patient-oriented research, with this really changing idea about the fact that patients need to be involved in the research process all along the research continuum, and that research should be focused on the patient voice and patient priorities. So next slide. So as I said, there's been this kind of shift in how we have thought about involving people in research. And I would say by and large, there's this idea about how can we build partnerships to think about and do research differently. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide, and I apologize for that, but really I think it just shows the depth and breadth of the places where patients can be involved in the research process. So we now see patients being involved before a study ever even starts in things like identifying priorities for research. So patients tell us, what is it that we are supposed to be researching? Patients are now leading and designing research themselves. And there's a researcher at the University of Calgary by the name of Deb Marshall, and she trains patients as researchers, and they are leading research projects. Patients are involved during studies themselves, and an example of this is using patients to disseminate information about studies so that in clinical trials and research studies, we're having better representation and better access to trials by using patients to get the word out to other patients. And then at the end of studies, we really want patients to help us disseminate knowledge or to get those research findings out to the people that should be benefiting from them. So you'll see more and more now patients are coming to scientific conferences and being involved in knowledge exchange in various different formats to get the word out to stakeholders and patients in a way that is manageable and that they can understand. So next slide. So because I'm a researcher, I have to tell you that there's evidence to show that involving patients in research is beneficial. We know that patients who are more actively participate in their care experience have greater satisfaction with their care. They have better health outcomes. Next slide. We know that patients and clinicians' priorities for research are not always reflected in the research that's being done. And to me, that's a real problem. Patients are interested in more than just drug interventions. Drug interventions are important. I'm not saying that they aren't. They are life-saving and life-prolonging for many patients, but there is also interest in things like lifestyle and education and complementary therapies. And we need to think about and honor those priorities of patients along with drug interventions. Next slide. So how can we take up this idea of patient-oriented research? How can we engage patients more in our research as researchers? And so I'm just going to give you a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it just gives you a flavor of the types of activities that have taken hold in the last. Oh, I hear an echo. There we go. It's gone. These ideas that have taken hold in the last decade for sure. So next slide. So one of the approaches to patient-oriented research that I have used is something called, it comes out of a group from the UK, and it's called the James Lind Alliance. I'm not sure if anybody has heard of it before. They were established in 2004, and it's a patient advocacy group that is partnered with the healthcare system there, the NIH. And their goal was really to bring together physicians and patients in something that they call priority setting partnerships, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they want to identify and prioritize shared uncertainties or unanswered research questions about the effects of treatment. So when they first started, it was really based on what are these unanswered questions about effects of treatment. But since that time, it has really grown to very broadly, what are unanswered research questions about all aspects of living with an illness? Next slide. And the James Lind Alliance fundamentally believes that patients, caregivers, and clinicians should work together to agree to which uncertainties or unanswered questions matter the most and deserve priority attention, because we know that research funding is scarce and it takes a lot of time to do research, and so it's resource intensive. And so the James Lind Alliance believes that if we ask patients and clinicians what are the priorities, then we're making the best use of our research dollars. Next slide. So they bring together patients, caregivers, and clinician groups on equal footing, and the equal footing part is really important. They identify treatment uncertainties, which are important to all groups. And then their goal is to really, once they've identified these priorities, is to come up with this top 10 list. So kind of a hallmark of the James Lind Alliance is this top 10 list, and I'll show you a top 10 list in a minute. And that really is so that that's a target for funding and for researchers to tackle the questions. However, they also want people to publish all of the uncertainties that have been identified so that researchers and funding agencies have access to them and can tackle those questions. So I have taken up this idea of a James Lind Alliance approach with early stage colorectal cancer, focused on early stage colorectal cancer. And so we've partnered with patients and caregivers, as well as clinicians and patient advocacy groups across Canada. So this is a national study. And our goal is to, just like any priority setting partnership approach, is to identify questions about living with and beyond early stage colorectal cancer that haven't been answered by research to date. So what do we still need to investigate? And we ultimately, we want to improve the lives of colorectal cancer patients, and then through that prioritize which questions are most important to patients, caregivers, and clinicians. And we took a very broad approach. So we asked people what their questions were very broadly, and they could have been related to diagnosis, prevention, treatment or treatment complications, rehabilitation, supportive care, or healthcare delivery. So we kind of asked very broadly, what do you want us to research? What are your priorities? Next slide. So I think this, and really we founded our priority setting partnership on kind of these principles. Patients are the ones that are living with their disease, and their perspective is important to understand. Caregivers and clinicians are the ones on the ground trying to help patients, and they have unique insight into questions that still need to be answered. And a broad perspective is really important to help shape the future research about colorectal cancer survivorship. So I think the next slide might be a video. Yeah. So I'm hoping that this works.
My experience dates back to the summer of 2015. I was diagnosed with rectal cancer, and then I began chemotherapy and 6 weeks of intensive radiation treatment, followed up by surgery, and then followed up by 4 months of chemotherapy after my surgery. Research is hugely important from the perspective that the more we understand, especially about colorectal surgery and the effects it has, and it's not all doom and gloom. You know, I've been very, very lucky and blessed that I was able to catch my cancer early and follow the proper steps through my treatment. The reason why I think it's important to have the patient voice in setting the priorities is because, to me, it's all about the patient, and we focus all our care around the patient. So why not start at the patient and making sure they are fully prepared to go through their journey with colorectal cancer. Well, my questions I'd like to see answered by research are more focused on what's important to the patient, both from a physical needs, mental and spiritual. Because when you're diagnosed with cancer, it's a very daunting task, and it's very daunting, I don't know what to say other than diagnosis. It's life-changing, it's life-altering. And so if you put yourselves in our shoes for just a moment and consider what we go through, for us what's important to a patient is being able to get answers, being able to do our own research on what puts us in the best possible shape to go through our journey and to have a successful outcome. Well, especially from a patient perspective, I ask that everybody get really involved in their own care. Like I said, it's all focused on the patient, and we're at the center of this. And so, be your own advocate. But what I think is important that everybody weighs in on the research. We're all part of this together, whether we are from Calgary, whether we're Albertans, or whether we're Canadians. It's important that we all have a say in our medical future and in our livelihood.
And I have to say, Gary was such an excellent speaker. That was totally unscripted. He just was such an amazing speaker. And I always love watching that video because I think he just says so eloquently what I never said if they interviewed me for that video. So, and that's on our website for our colorectal cancer study. So very briefly, the details of how this research is conducted is probably not that important to you or not that interesting to you, but what we did was we sent out a survey very broadly to patients, caregivers, and clinicians across the country, and we asked them what they wanted us to research from their perspective, what was important for colorectal cancer survivorship. They sent back the answers to the survey, and we kind of gathered all those answers together. And surprisingly, even though we had hundreds of responses, there was about 120 questions that were fairly similar. And then with our research committee, including our patient partners, we kind of narrowed those down to 66 questions. So we came up with a list of 66 questions. We're now in stage 3 of this study. So we've sent those 66 questions back out to people in a survey format and asked them to vote. And we've said, out of these 66, which are your priority questions? And then the final stage of this research is we're coming together in a virtual meeting, not an in-person meeting, in the fall with a group of patients, caregivers, and clinicians, and we're going to vote on our top 10. So we're nearly done this research study. And the James Lind Alliance, this type of approach has been used in over 70 priority setting partnerships. I think that number is actually bigger now. This slide is about 1.5 years old. And they've looked at all kinds of conditions, including benign and malignant conditions and prostate cancer. So I'll show you their top 10 in a minute to see what you think about the prostate cancer one that was done. Next slide. One of our oncologists at the Tom Baker Cancer Center, Dr. Nancy Nixon, used a similar approach with metastatic breast cancer. This study was, I believe, finished about 2 years ago. And next slide. I want to highlight her study because I think it shows the impact of this type of research. So after they came to their top 10 and published their results, the pharmaceutical company Pfizer put out a call for research, for future research and for funding. And next slide. And in that call, it actually said that the top 10 research areas identified by Dr. Nixon's study were needed to be considered for funding. So the power of the patient voice in setting the research agenda is, I think, very strongly highlighted by this example. And I just think that it shows how important it is for us to involve patients in research, and that funders want to fund studies that patients say are important. Next slide. So there was actually a prostate cancer priority setting partnership done in 2009 in the UK. So, 11 years ago now. So I don't know if anybody in the room is familiar with this study. I see Brad smiling a little bit, so I don't know if he knows about it at all. But I just want to, I have the top 10 here. I'll just, the next slide. So it would be interesting to see if you as a group thought that any of these priorities were important for you or would be important in Canada, or if they've changed in the last 11 years. So I'll just quickly read them, and then it might be something that we can talk about after. I only have a few slides after this. So their number one priority was how can overtreatment for prostate cancer be prevented by identifying and excluding the treatment of harmless tumors. And I like how they said tigers versus pussycats. I don't know if that's common lingo in prostate cancer world. Is there a genetic marker for prostate cancer that would be more sensitive and more specific than PSA serum levels? What can be done to delay or prevent the onset of hormone-independent prostate cancer? Are there dietary measures that can prevent prostate cancer or slow its progression? And diet is definitely a question that came up with our top 66 as well. Does serial PSA measurement in patients with prostate cancer accurately monitor disease progression? Would prostate cancer screening targeted at high-risk groups, those with positive family history, ethnic minorities with higher rates, improve outcomes in treatments in these groups? And does active surveillance work for treatment of prostate cancer? And that question might have been answered already. I'm not, like I said, I'm not 100% familiar with prostate cancer from a clinical perspective. And then they had 4 that were kind of tied for 8th. Do variations in GP awareness of prostate cancer affect outcomes? What is the effectiveness of new treatments, such as high intensity focused ultrasound and cryotherapy? Is there a vaccine that can prevent prostate cancer? And are there non-intrusive diagnostic tests that will identify patients with aggressive prostate cancer whilst not identifying harmless cancers, so that tigers and pussycats? Again, I only have a few slides left, so we can maybe finish my slides and then come back to this if you want, but I'd be really interested to hear, just out of curiosity more than anything, if these are things that you would still prioritize or prioritize from your own patient experience with prostate cancer. Next slide. So patients are also involved in our research process in other ways. So I'm not sure if anybody in the Zoom room is aware of the Canadian Clinical Trials Group, and they have a very active patient engagement model. And they kind of say that patients should be involved in 2 different ways as trial participants, and they very actively want patients to be involved in clinical trials. A presentation that I was at that they gave at a conference, I think they said only about 10% of eligible patients actually participate in clinical trials. And of course that varies by region and by cancer center, but a lot of clinical trials are very beneficial for patients, and without greater participation, then the results aren't the same. The results can be skewed by a number of things. So they are very active in trying to get people to participate. And then they also have patient representation on a number of different committees and subcommittees, and really their goal is to ensure that the research question is developed properly, that it's feasible, and that outcomes that matter to patients are being measured. So they have a very amazing patient group that I've had the pleasure to interact with. So that's one example. And then next slide. And then patients are also being more involved at the end of the research spectrum. So as I said before, where when it comes to scientific conferences, and you see more and more at every scientific conference you go to, that patient partners are involved in those conferences. So I was at a conference last fall, which feels like 100 years ago now. Because I haven't left Calgary for so long, but it was the Canadian Cancer Research Alliance conference. I don't know if anybody in the room was at that conference, but they had something really neat called the Patient Involvement Program. And basically patients, caregivers, or people from advocacy groups attended the scientific sessions, and they were paired with a scientific mentor. And so there was the opportunity for kind of discussion about the results of studies between the two. And the goal was to inform patients and caregivers about the most up-to-date research, but maybe more importantly, it was to inform the scientific community about patients' and caregivers' views and experiences with cancer. And I would say, I don't know if they put out any official statistics, but I would say at least 30 to 40% of the attendees at that conference were patient partners. So it was a really neat experience actually for me as a researcher. Next slide. And then we are also seeing patients being involved in advisory committees. And this can be either through informal or formal structures. So research groups or researchers themselves are partnering with patients and family advisory committees to shape research questions, decide on outcome measures, and ensure knowledge is deliverable back to stakeholders. So some examples we have of this in Alberta are the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, or SPORE, and the Patient and Family Advisory Committee within Alberta Health Services. And then researchers themselves are forming more informal relationships. So I myself have 3 colorectal cancer patients that are kind of informally my advisory members, and I call on whenever I'm submitting a grant or am thinking about an idea for research. And oftentimes these patient partners are listed on the grant and provide feedback, and especially about feasibility and the importance of the question before it's even submitted. And oh, can you just go back one more? Thanks. The thing that I think we really need to think about as researchers, and I would love to hear your ideas about this as patients, is I wonder if the pendulum may have swung a bit too far, or is starting to swing too far, because a lot of the people that participate as advisory members or in different talks, it's almost always this, it's kind of like everything in life, it's always the same people that volunteer to do everything. And I worry about overburdening people with too much responsibility, because for some people it becomes almost like a full-time job. So just, I think, something that we need to think about. And again, I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Next slide. So where is the future of patient engagement in cancer research going? So if we gaze into the crystal ball, where do we think this is going? Well, I think that when we think about multidisciplinary or different types of people involved in research, that the patient and caregiver are more and more going to be considered a discipline that have to be included in our research. We are definitely moving towards a patient and caregiver-driven research agenda, and you saw an example of that from Pfizer funding patient research priorities from the Metastatic Breast Priority Setting Partnership. I'm hoping that we will also develop stronger evidence for the benefits and potentially harms of conducting patient-oriented research. And we definitely will have a greater emphasis on knowledge translation back to stakeholders to ensure that we have efficient and effective use of, and that should say scarce, not scare, research dollars. And I think that's it. Yeah. So I open it up to any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas about how to engage patients in research. I'm really open to hearing anything that you have to say.
Just a recommendation to if anybody has questions, if you can just do the thumbs up, and then we'll try and control the overlap of speakers and cutting in and out. So, questions? Boy, it's a quiet group tonight. What?
Oh, I'm just getting wound up.
Yeah. And I see Bob Phillips is next. So, Stuart,
Bob, you
go
go
ahead.
first.
Okay, Bob Phillips. You're on mute, Bob.
Okay.
There
Awesome.
you go. Now we can hear you.
Okay. Well, Colleen, that was a rather interesting walkthrough on not just what you're working on, but the processes of research that you're applying. I never heard it so how can I say detailed before, and it's amazing. You know, like you just don't miss anything. You know, you're on top of just about everything in terms of what you're focusing on there. I was gonna say, do you apply like let's see, like I mean, an advisory committee on any of these type of projects?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think more and more we are seeing from very broadly, even when we submit a research grant, all the way to, as I said, conferences or talks that we go to, that patients are it's very highly recommended that patients are involved from the beginning of a research project. So as an example, I am just in the process of writing a grant about colorectal cancer, and it's highly recommended in the instructions for the grant that patient partners are involved and have reviewed your idea and your grant to make sure that it is something that patients would want to be researched. So I would say more and more we're seeing that this is a really important aspect of research going forward. And it's kind of an interesting dilemma, though, as I said, because often it's always the same people that come forward and say that they're willing to do it. And kind of the reach of being able to find other people to be willing to kind of go along with you in this research endeavor is not always easy. And so I think it would be really great if organizations like patient advocacy organizations, such as Prostate Calgary, were thought more or kind of creatively or thoughtfully about research endeavors and how that also benefits their members and how their members could be involved. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it's kind of direction that you might be getting from the group. That's it. Thanks.
Colleen, this is Stuart Campbell speaking. My professional career was in technology management consulting, primarily within the agricultural area. And I ended up reviewing upwards to 130 research proposals a year in Alberta from agricultural researchers. I was in the back room, I wasn't in the front room. And so the scientists didn't know that another scientist was actually, and a business management consultant was actually looking at some of their work. One of the biggest difficulties I think that researchers have, and it's a question that I had to answer very early on in my practice, was what is research? And so I came up with a protocol, if you will, algorithm, whatever they call it today. where research might be new to science. Research might be new to Canada. Research might be new to Alberta. And in the agricultural context, we have essentially 5 agroclimatic regions, agricultural climatic regions. And so research could be relevant to one of those regions, or it could be the research that a farmer might think is research. I think you have the same dilemma. And I'm sure that maybe Keith Gilchrist, who is listening in on this, will have a similar dilemma, because the commercial company that is producing a new drug is functioning in a space that is entirely different and unknown, if you will, to the patient. And yet there must be feedback that feed forward and feedback that allows people to set their priorities. How do you look at that term research? And I'd also like you to think about, how do you look at the term fund and grant application as opposed to invest and investment? I had a devil of a time trying to convince agricultural researchers that this is all about investment and return against specific outcomes, and clearly defining what the objectives of that research are supposed to be. Go for it. It's that continuum, that very, very broad,
Yeah.
wide continuum. And how do you bring about some understanding amongst those different people?
Yeah, I think, as I said at the beginning, that I define research just as a systematic process to answering a
I
question.
agree with that.
So I think however the researcher is framing their question, I think really kind of should further define the goals and even
Sure.
what the impact is going to be. I think I agree with you, the research and investment should go hand in hand, but they don't always.
That's right.
So I don't know if I have the answer to that, other than to say that, you should be thinking about the impact of your research at the beginning and not at the end. And I think that's how patients identifying what research and priorities are important helps with that piece, because if patients have said, we want answers to this question,
Yeah.
then I think that already tells you that what the impact or the investment of those research dollars is going to be.
Unfortunately, in the case of prostate cancer, we have a very, very classic case of misappropriation of funds, because there was an inadequate definition of what the need was and how to proceed to identify the validity of something that we all know is called the PSA test.
Mm.
And it's classic for major trials having been designed internationally and executed with very, very little feed forward coming in from the patient and what have you. And it's a waste of 20 to 30 years of knowledge of how that test can be used before an individual is actually classified as a patient. In other words, before that individual even gets close to the prostate cancer center and the urologists over there. In other words, early detection. And it's an excellent test, but it's taken 20 to 30 years for people to finally come to understand, not well accepted yet, that early testing at midlife, age 40, repeated at intervals of 2 to 4 years, can save lives through early detection. And one of your one of the questions that you had in from 10 years ago
Mhm.
actually relates to that. And the problem is, have we learned? At present, I'm not so sure that we've yet learned how to truly apply the PSA test in a pre-patient population, as opposed to a patient population. Once the patient has been identified, the PSA test is very, very valid in terms of tracking either progression or regression of the disease. And right now, I know personally that I've got a log 10 straight line that's going straight down in my chemo treatment. And I can predict within 1 or 2 PSA units what my PSA will be at the end of this next infusion, which I get on Thursday. Anyway, all I'm doing is applying my knowledge of science and some numbers, knowledge of numbers. I'm not a numbers person, but I do think that the process that you've talked about is fundamentally correct. And I just wished that some of those questions of an integration of patient input had happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And some of that actually relates to a role that our pharma sponsors don't necessarily get involved with very heavily. And that would be in this pre-patient population. They do like us to participate in the clinical trials, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have worked as a support group to help bring understanding within companies of what the patient thinks about some new drug that has come through a phase 3 trial. So we have a track record of that. Anyway, Bob, Bob Shield, you've got a long history in this whole field. Any thoughts to add to it?
Oh, he's muted. You're muted, Bob.
Can you hear me now?
There
Yeah.
you go.
How many times do you hear that in a Zoom meeting? Can you hear?
Yeah,
A lot.
you're muted.
You got to be trained.
Did you really have a specific question for me, or was it just sort of a general comment about my longevity? Stuart? I can't hear me.
I'm sorry.
Did you have a specific question for me, or was it a general question about my longevity?
Your observations of what's happened over 10 or 20 years in terms of patient engagement.
Well, it's certainly improved in my 25 years being involved in this group and being a prostate cancer patient. And it continues to evolve. I have to admit that the last 3 years I've really been sitting on the sidelines, Stuart. So, I'm probably not the right person to ask about what the current situation is like. But sort of
Your list of the 10 questions, Colleen, were excellent. I think if we were to look at those and react to them, how it might have been 10 years ago versus what it is today, we'd be astounded at some of the progress. We also would be sorry that there hasn't been more progress in some of the other areas.
Yeah, I was going to say out of those 10, there might be a change in some of the priorities,
Yeah.
but a lot of the questions still there.
Hmm. It's interesting. Yeah. And I would say, I think an important part of this priority setting partnership approach is to make sure that once people, like any study, once you have the results, that's really just kind of the beginning, right? You have to then carry those priorities forward and make sure that people know about them, researchers know about them, funding agencies know about them. And so as a group in the UK, I'm not sure how widely kind of disseminated those top 10 questions were, or are those questions ones that are just inherently really difficult to answer and take a lot of time from a research perspective? I don't know. As I said, I don't know a lot about
Sure.
prostate cancer, but I think it's interesting that a lot of those questions are still remaining.
Keith Gilchrist, could I pose a question to you?
Please.
To think about what your experience was or what the needs were 10 years ago versus needs today and what's changed along the way, particularly in patient engagement.
Yeah, fantastic question, Stuart. In my corner of the pharma world has been perhaps later in product development for sure, and certainly we've seen a really great improvement in the transparency and the invitation for a patient voice for CADTH in its review process, including that patient voice in the health technology assessment process for new products. And those recommendations that CADTH provides to public payers across the country are really instrumental in deciding which products get added to provincial formularies and which don't. And so over the last 10 years, I think we've seen a sea change in how those voices are invited and incorporated into those types of process. But it's not a perfect process by any means.
Sure.
And I think I think there'll be voices across the country that would argue that we're only an inch along the pathway there. It needs to be way more transparent, and patient voices need to be way more influential in that process for sure. I'm afraid I can't speak to patient input in Janssen or Johnson & Johnson early R&D, up to the point of clinical trials. So I'm afraid I can't speak to that. So.
Sure, fine, thank you.
I can make just one more comment, and I guess this refers back to the last 3 or 4 years. I really think that prostate cancer as a disease seems to have fallen onto the back burner. I'm not aware of it the way I was 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe it's because I'm not as involved in the day-to-day operations of the support group as I was then, but it just seems to me that 3 or 4 years ago, you would hear references on the radio, you'd hear stories in the news, there'd be stories in the newspaper. It came up a lot, and I don't think it does anymore. Does anybody disagree with me on that?
I think, Bob Shiel, the biggest difference over a 10-year period is probably the adoption of active surveillance as an initial therapy approach. And that was basically an idea created at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto with Lawrence Klotz and others. But the adoption of active surveillance has significantly impacted the numbers that are of guys that are being pushed into accelerated decisions on surgery and radiotherapy. And at the opposite end, we have to give an awful lot of credit to the scientists and the pharma companies that have brought a whole host of new drugs that were not available 10 years ago. And that treatment path is so fundamentally different than what it was 10 years ago, now, today. And so I don't know how well that message is being communicated out to the community. But the next big step in my mind to getting a good solid handle on this disease is to sort out what a man's risk is at midlife and how to deal with that. Because those scientists that are born and bred in population genetic studies,
It's a test.
they don't get down to the individual. And that's a real fundamental problem because it's the individual that has the risk. The population risk is true. If you're the province of Alberta, you've got a population risk there, but it does not address the risk of individuals. And that's where I think the next major gain is possibly going to come. Also, there was reference to the genetic components of disease, Colleen, and spectacular advances in this whole area of genotyping, both the inherent genetic background of the disease and the somatic changes that happen in the tumor. Fantastic stuff going on there.
So what Stuart's saying is identifying those tigers and pussycats, separating those two, and that's key. So
Yeah, I get on my soapbox every once in a while, and now I'm going off.
okay. All right. Well, man, that was such an excellent presentation, Colleen. We appreciate that. I know it's for Irene Yee from Bayer and Keith Gilchrist from Jensen. It's late. You are well into the evening, so we appreciate your time tonight. Colleen, we appreciate you making the effort. You did excellent work. If this was your first Zoom presentation, it was well done, so we
Great.
appreciate that. And for the rest of the members that joined us, yes, we did make history tonight. It was a little shaky at the start, but I appreciate everybody's patience as we work through this new venture. And